The opening text tells us that for over 500 years, the Maori, a local tribe, fought with edged weapons, but in the 1800s they adopted muskets and then Christianity. Opening up in 1830 right there on the Tasman River, a group of sea merchants transports a reverend who had come for missionary work, but in the course of their voyage, they are met with a fierce storm. Unfortunately, during the panic, a crew member dies. The next morning, when the sea had gone back to sleep, the crew pays their respect to the dead. They ask Mr. Munro the Reverend to offer benediction to the dead. Munro blesses his soul as they toss the body into the sea. Later that day, while Munro works on his drawings, the captain of the ship, Kedgley, comes to thank him for giving out a worthy eulogy to the man who lost his life. He inquires about Munro's past. Munro tells him that he comes from the family of shipbuilders and now he has taken on the garment of a minister. The captain assures him that he is certainly in the right place as this corner of the world is for outcasts. Munro goes over to draw a portrait of one of the tribal men he saw working with the crew. The captain identifies him as Winuku. He tells Munro that he is the son of a paramount chief and his father had asked him to teach Winuku seacraft. The men reach their destination as they proceed to land ashore. Munro is told that there are lots of Maoris locals in the area. Munro takes his horse as he marches on to explore the land. During a brief conversation with Winuku, he explains his tribal heritage, which includes the whale tooth he hangs around his neck, which represents the voice of his father's god, and the painting on his face represents the story of his life. Later on, as Munro goes to tend to his horse, he sees a girl from the Maori tribe. He tries to make her see that he means no harm as she advances to touch his horse. But then she is stopped by her fellow tribesmen who try to attack Munro. Luckily, Munro is saved by the captain as he pleads that Munro meant no disrespect by trespassing on their land. He makes a little trade with them and they let Munro leave. Just as they prepare to leave for Epworth, Munro's final destination, he asks that he camp on land a little while before they leave. Due to his persuasion, the captain decides to let him stay on land with Winuku. Just as Munro decides to lay down a little to rest, he is disturbed by a war cry. As he goes to check it out, he is surprised to see two locals engaging in a bloody battle. The captain, who was already on the ship, noticed this and then hurries to come get Munro, as he wouldn't get paid if he doesn't bring him to Epworth. Just as the fight continues, the chief notices Munro and then puts the bloody battle to a halt. Anaku introduces him as Ekaterwa, the chief of the Ngareha tribe. They had murdered everyone except for two Maoris. Munro pleads that they spare their lives, but the chief tells him that he has no business with his people and Munro shouldn't dare to meddle. Just as they negotiate for their release, the captain interferes on Munro's behalf. He tells the chief that Munro is his cargo and he doesn't mean any harm. A stubborn Munro offers to trade his horse for the release of the Maoris. The chief accepts the trade but then kills one of them as he insists on one horse for one life. Meanwhile, we realize that the captured Maoris were couples as the woman Rangjamai weeps bitterly over her husband's death. Munro takes Rangjamai to his cabin as she mourns the death of her husband. The following morning they arrive at Epworth, where they are met by Mr. Beauchamp. He welcomes Munro and Rangjamai as he shows them where they would stay. Over the next few days, Rangjamai continues her mourning ritual as Munro goes over to check out the sanctuary he will use for the Lord's worship. There he is met by Reginald, who invites Munro to come have dinner with the people of Epworth. Later that day, Munro goes back home to find Rangjamai shivering. He sees that she was brutally injured during the battle, and she probably could be infected. A concerned Munro takes care of her wound, hoping to find a better nurse that would stop the infection. He goes down to have dinner with the chiefs of Epworth, as they discuss his background and the town's history. They tell him that Epworth pays rent to a local warlord named Minoi, the chief of Maori. But lately they have been hearing rumors of a dangerous warlord named Ekaterwa. He's been launching attacks and claiming lands. The people of Epworth fear him as they believe he's a thorough savage. Munro confirms this by saying he had encountered him recently. He goes in to ask for medical assistance for the woman under his care, but the doctor refuses to grant his request, saying medical resources are only for the people of Epworth. After the dinner, one of the council's daughter comes to meet Munro. She tells him about a woman who could help him treat Rangjamai's wounds. Munro heads out to meet Miss Hegarty at her cottage. He tells her about the injured Maori woman who needs urgent treatment. Hegarty comes over to see the sick Rangjamai. She recognizes her as the daughter of Minoi, the warlord of Maori. After a brief checkup, she gives Munro a medicine that would help stop the infection. He's instructed to make sure she drinks the medicine. The next morning, the town bell is being rung as Minoi and his men had come to Epworth. Rangjamai goes over to meet her father. She demands him to exact revenge on her husband's killer. Just as Minoi comforts her, he brings forth captured Ekaterwa's men. Rangjamai looks for her husband's killer, but none of them fits the description. Manawi becomes furious and then orders their execution. After the death of the men, Higurdi introduces Munro to Manawi. She tells him that he's a holy man and he had rescued Rangjamai from the hands of Ekatarwa. Manawi then instructs Rangjamai to stay with the Reverend. He assigns Perfura, one of his men, to protect her. Just as Manawi leaves, the people of Epworth cast a bad eye on Munro and Higurdi because they chose to keep the outcasts in their cottage. The following days, Rangjamai and Perfura help Munro in setting up the chapel and organizing worship. One day after church, they head out to Mr. Paget's store. Munro inquires about his absence in the chapel, but he tells Munro that he isn't a man of the faith. He continues by saying they are in a trap and many miles away from civilization. The next day, Higurdi teaches Rangjamai how to dance as she has recently developed an interest in dancing. They bond as they dance alone in the forest. Meanwhile, at the church, Mr. Beauchamp notices that his daughter has begun to fall in love with the Maori slave that was brought to protect Rangjamai. After the service, Mr. Beauchamp goes to meet Munro. He expresses his disinterest in the Maori locals living amongst them. He tells Munro that they can't just accommodate them as their differences are too vast to reconcile. Later that night, Mr. Beauchamp's daughter goes over to meet Perfura at the chapel, and the two make out, creating a sexual tension between them. The next morning, Munro and the Maori head over to Mr. Paget's store to get supplies, but he refuses to sell to the Maoris, only Munro, as he has been threatened by the council. Meanwhile, Rangjamai urges Munro to take her to the town's dance ceremony that night. At the ceremony, Mr. Beauchamp notices his daughter sneak out of the dance hall as he suspects she had gone to see the Perfura. With the help of Mrs. Higurdi, Rangjamai is given a total makeover which stuns everyone in town. She asks Mr. Munro to join her on the dance floor as they both dance happily. On the other hand, Mr. Beauchamp secretly orders some men to kill Perfura, as he is fed up with the outcast. After the ceremony, Munro and Rangjamai go back home to meet Perfura drowned in his own blood. Just as Rangjamai mourns his death, Munro goes to meet the council raging. He is disappointed that Perfura was murdered like a dog, yet the people of Epworth claim the savages are outside their walls. Letting out his rage, he demands justice for the innocent Perfura. Reginald promises him that they will hunt down the culprit and he doesn't need to worry. The next morning, Mrs. Higurdi and Rangjamai embalm Perfura's body as Mr. Reginald comes to report to Munro that they have found the culprit. Munro rushes to the town square. He finds out that Paget has been severely beaten by the townsmen. Paget cries out to Munro that he isn't the murderer. Although the council insists that he will face trials, Munro doesn't believe that Paget is the killer. Beauchamp's daughter comes to pay a visit to her dead lover. She weeps as she sees Perfura's body lying lifeless on the floor. She gives them her horse as they proceed to return his lifeless body to his people. Higurdi decides to accompany them as she will become Munro's translator. Just as they are leaving the town, the council chiefs, in fear of what Manawi might do, tells Munro to tell them that justice has been carried out on behalf of his people and Paget is dead. Munro suspects that the chiefs have killed Paget, so he refuses to listen to them. They remind him of his responsibility to Epworth still, yet he ignores them. While on their journey, they decide to stop and rest for a while. Higurdi notices Munro's sketches. She acknowledges his gift as they share a conversation relating to her husband who died in battle. After they had all gone to bed, Rangjamai goes over to check his sketchbook. She sees that Munro was drawing a portrait of her. The next morning, they arrive at her village, where they present Perfura's dead body to the Maori people. They all chant as they mourn his death. At night, while the elders gather, Munro tells them that he feels responsible for the death of Perfura, and that is why he brought his body back to them. Manawi tells him not to be sad, as he saved his daughter's life. He asks for the culprit and what should be done to Epworth, but Munro pleads that he raises their rent instead. The next day, Munro sits outside his hut as he draws one of the Maori's elder. When the elder gives him a stern look, he goes into the woods to meet up with Higurdi. She tells him about the Maori's way of life and how they could carve anything out of woods. Curious about what could be on Munro's sketchbook, the elder orders his slave to steal the book. Meanwhile, Munro goes on to teach Rangjamai and her people how to use the British musket and reload it faster. That night, Munro is summoned to the Elders' Council. They ask him to tell them his main reason for coming, as they suspect he could be hiding something. They show him his sketchbook, which contains drawings of war scenes. Munro opens up to them. He tells them that he was a soldier in the British Army, and one time he led an attack against the enemy under strict orders. They discharged smoke in the enemy's camp as they used knives and swords in close quarters to finish them up. Eventually, when the smoke cleared, it dawned on him that he had murdered both women and children. While holding back tears, Munro tells the chief that he left the army feeling guilty for what he had done. Then God decides to grant him redemption by making him a minister. The elders tell him that he shouldn't seek redemption with peace because only blood redeems blood. Back at his hut, Hecate comes to comfort him as they kiss and make out. The next morning, she tells him about her background and how she got to live with the Maori during a bloody war that took the lives of her husband and daughter. Just as the Maori people begin training for a possible war, the ship merchant Kedgley comes to the village to trade muskets to the chief. He tells them that the price had changed due to its demand and supply. Munro, who feels that they are drifting towards a path of destruction, then asks that he negotiate peace with Ekaterwa on behalf of Maori. Manoe then permits him to go speak with Ekaterwa. He tells him that if he manages to convince Ekaterwa to make peace, the people of Maori will serve as God. On their way to meet Ekaterwa, Kedgley tells Munro that he's on a fool's mission as he's only putting his life in danger. Ekaterwa is a vicious savage, and he won't listen to any plea of peace. Munro goes down to his cabin. He is surprised to see Rajamai hiding there. He reprimands her for following him as it is a suicide mission. She offers him a gift to give Ekaterwa as a sign of peace. Munro tells her to remain in the cabin and not come out for any reason. Upon arrival, Munro goes to meet the savage warlord Ekaterwa. His tent is decorated with several decapitated heads. Munro tells him that he had come on behalf of Manoe as he desires peace between the two kingdoms, but Ekaterwa declines the offer, saying he breathes violence and his land is steeped in blood. Ekaterwa threatens to kill Munro when he suggests that both kingdoms come as one to fight against their real enemy. After an unsuccessful attempt to convert the warlord, Munro leaves the tent. Meanwhile, Kedgley presents the musket to Ekaterwa. He tells him that prices have gone up due to demand and supply. On hearing this, Ekaterwa kills Kedgley as his men attack the remaining British merchants. Munro tries to escape with his horse, but unfortunately, he is caught by one of Ekaterwa's men. They engage in an intense fight, but luckily Rajamai saves him by shooting the man. They both escape to report the news to Manoe. Munro warns them that Ekaterwa may have more military power than them because they have hijacked Kedgley's ship, which has cannons and lots of muskets. They are to prepare for battle as Ekaterwa and his men are on their way. Munro pledges his allegiance to Manoe, saying he will fight with them to the end. Just then Manoe motivates his people for war as Ekaterwa arrives with his men, each one with a musket. They sing their war chants before pushing an attack against the Maoris. With the help of the cannon, they are able to destroy so many cottages and cause panic in the village. Manoe and his men fight back as they engage them in a fierce bloody battle. When Ekaterwa's men finally infiltrate their village, Manoe puts up the smoke strategy as his men ambush Ekaterwa's men from close range using their local weapons. The Ngatiha tribe found it impossible to win this battle as they needed to reload their musket but couldn't due to the thick smoke. During the bloody battle, Hecate is shot. Munro, who couldn't control his rage due to her death, brutally kills anyone he came across. He is stopped by Rajamai, who comforts him. After their enormous victory, Ekaterwa surrenders. Manoe lets him know that he could have gone for peace. Ekaterwa lets him know that he would rather die as a warlord. He kills Ekaterwa, spares his son Luniku. Manoe establishes peace between the two kingdoms as he reconnects their families again. 4 years later, Luniku gets married to Rajamai as they go to meet the King of England representative, Mr. Cornwell. He tells them that the king desires to take their land for a custom and excise post. Munro tells him that the king has to pay the required rentals to use their land. They are astonished by his statement, but Munro tells them that he's now a Maori and his story is written on his face. The end. If you enjoy historical movies like this, please subscribe for more videos. Goodbye till we meet again.